Dopamine is commonly misunderstood as the brain's pleasure chemical, but in reality it's much more accurate to think of it as the molecule of pursuit. When you anticipate or move towards something you want, whether it's a goal, an achievement, or even something as simple as eating when you're hungry, dopamine levels rise. This rise creates a sense of drive, a feeling of energy that pushes you forward. What most people miss is that dopamine is not about the reward itself, it's about getting you to act in order to obtain that reward. This distinction is crucial, because if you only allow yourself to experience dopamine at the point of reward, you end up weakening your motivation system over time. The real power lies in learning to attach dopamine to the effort itself, not just the outcomes. When you focus only on results, the dopamine spike comes at the finish line. That might feel good for a moment, but afterward dopamine quickly drops below baseline, leaving you feeling drained or unmotivated. Over time, this creates a cycle where you procrastinate or avoid effort, because the brain associates the hard work with a long period of low dopamine and only a brief spike at the end. On the other hand, if you consciously shift your perspective so that effort itself is rewarding, you change the way the dopamine system operates. Each step of progress becomes a source of motivation, not just the final achievement. This shift doesn't happen automatically, it requires deliberate practice. One way to do this is by reframing self-talk during challenging tasks. For instance, when studying, exercising, or working through a difficult project, instead of focusing on how far away the reward is, you remind yourself that the act of engaging, of struggling and pushing, is itself what's valuable. The brain is highly adaptable, and with repetition, it starts to release dopamine during the activity itself rather than withholding it until the reward is achieved. Scientists call this attaching dopamine to the process. Athletes, musicians, and successful learners often do this intuitively. They fall in love with the grind, the training, the long hours of practice, and not just the medals or accolades. There's also a biological reason why this works. Dopamine is released from neurons in areas like the ventral tegmental area and substantia nigra, and these signals travel to regions like the nucleus accumbens and prefrontal cortex. These circuits are sensitive not only to external rewards but also to internal cues, meaning your mindset, your interpretation of the experience, can shape when dopamine is released. By training your attention on the effort and finding meaning or satisfaction in it, you engage these same circuits in a way that reinforces motivation at every step. The outcome of this practice is a much more sustainable relationship with work and goals. Instead of being caught in the emotional rollercoaster of waiting for the final payoff, you create a steady stream of motivation that carries you forward. The brain learns to see effort not as a cost but as a source of energy. Over time, this makes you more resilient, because even when external rewards are uncertain or delayed, you still feel driven to keep going. It's not about tricking the brain, it's about aligning your biology with a mindset that supports consistent action. When we think about motivation, it's natural to assume that rewarding ourselves every time we make progress will keep us moving forward. On the surface, this seems logical. You put in effort, you give yourself a treat, and you stay motivated. But the dopamine system in the brain doesn't actually work that way. Dopamine is highly sensitive to predictability. If the brain knows exactly when and how it's going to get a reward, the dopamine response gradually weakens. This is why doing the same activity with the same reward again and again becomes less exciting over time. The brain adapts, and the dopamine system becomes less responsive. The result is that you start losing motivation even if the activity hasn't changed. Intermittent rewards, on the other hand, keep the dopamine system active and strong. When the brain cannot fully predict if or when a reward will come, the dopamine spike is greater, and motivation stays higher. This principle is seen everywhere in life. Slot machines in casinos are the classic example. People keep playing not because they win every time, but because they don't know when the next win will come. The unpredictability itself creates a powerful dopamine response that keeps them engaged. The same principle applies to our everyday goals, except here we can use it in a healthy and constructive way. Imagine you're studying for an exam. If you reward yourself with a snack or a social media break every single chapter, your brain quickly learns the pattern, and the reward becomes less stimulating. Eventually, you'll find yourself less motivated to continue because the dopamine response isn't strong enough to keep pushing you. But if you make the rewards intermittent, sometimes after 2 chapters, sometimes after 4, sometimes skipping them altogether, the unpredictability sustains the dopamine release. Your brain stays engaged because it's anticipating the possibility of a reward without knowing exactly when it will happen. The same concept applies in training and work. Athletes who focus only on guaranteed rewards, like medals or praise, may burn out when those external rewards don't come often enough. But if they internalize a system of intermittent rewards, sometimes allowing themselves a break, sometimes pushing through without one, their brain stays motivated for much longer. The dopamine spikes are stronger precisely because the timing of the reward isn't fixed. Scientists call this principle variable reinforcement, and it's one of the most powerful ways to shape behavior and maintain motivation. What makes intermittent rewards so effective is that they mimic how dopamine evolved to function. In nature, rewards are not guaranteed. A hunter might search for hours or days before finding food. Early humans never knew when success would come, and it was this unpredictability that kept them motivated to keep searching. The brain is wired for uncertainty, and by aligning with that wiring, we tap into a deep, powerful source of drive. By consciously introducing unpredictability into how we reward our efforts, we can keep our dopamine system responsive, our motivation strong, and our ability to pursue long-term goals intact even when outcomes are not immediate or guaranteed. The concept of protecting your baseline dopamine is central to maintaining long-term motivation and focus. Dopamine works in a wave-like cycle. It rises during pursuit or anticipation, then falls back down. After a spike, it doesn't just return to the exact same level, it often dips below baseline before stabilizing. If you repeatedly drive dopamine very high through artificial means, the baseline level slowly decreases, leaving you with less motivation for everyday activities. This is why people who constantly chase stimulation often report feeling unmotivated, restless, or bored when not engaged with something intensely rewarding. Their system has adapted to expect big spikes, so normal life feels flat. Every time you engage in highly stimulating activities, whether it's scrolling endlessly on social media, playing video games for hours, eating junk food, or consuming too much caffeine, you are elevating dopamine levels. While these activities may feel enjoyable, in the moment, they come at the cost of lowering your baseline if repeated too often. The brain has a mechanism called homeostasis. It doesn't want dopamine to stay elevated all the time, so it compensates by reducing sensitivity to dopamine or by lowering the baseline. This explains why something that once felt exciting eventually feels dull, and why people end up chasing bigger and bigger stimuli just to feel the same level of motivation they once had. Protecting the baseline means being strategic with how you interact with rewarding activities. Instead of stacking multiple dopamine-inducing behaviors on top of each other, for example, eating highly processed food while watching fast-paced videos with caffeine in your system, it's important to experience activities in a cleaner, more deliberate way. Doing so prevents overstimulation and allows the brain to reset more effectively. This doesn't mean eliminating enjoyable activities altogether, but rather avoiding excessive layering of stimuli that push dopamine too high and too often. One of the most effective ways to protect your baseline is to deliberately engage in low dopamine activities. Taking a walk without your phone, practicing quiet breathing, spending time in nature, or even allowing yourself to sit with boredom gives the brain a chance to reset. These periods of low stimulation are not wasted time, they're essential recovery phases that let dopamine receptors remain sensitive. When you return to higher effort tasks afterward, you'll find it easier to feel motivated. This is because your baseline is intact and your brain hasn't adapted to expect constant spikes. Sleep, nutrition, and exercise also play critical roles in maintaining dopamine balance. Proper rest allows dopamine stores to replenish. Balanced nutrition provides the amino acid precursors needed for dopamine production, and physical activity has been shown to enhance dopamine receptor sensitivity. By combining these habits with a mindful approach to stimulation, you create an environment in which your baseline stays healthy. In the long run, protecting your dopamine baseline is about preserving your ability to feel motivated and engaged by the things that truly matter. By resisting the constant pull of artificial dopamine spikes and allowing space for recovery, you ensure that your brain continues to respond to effort and reward in a balanced and sustainable way. Balancing high and low dopamine activities is one of the most effective strategies for sustaining long-term motivation and avoiding burnout. The brain is designed to respond to a rhythm of stimulation and recovery. High dopamine activities are those that provide excitement, novelty, or intense reward signals, things like achieving a big milestone, exercising at high intensity, playing competitive games, socializing in stimulating environments, or even working on a deeply engaging project. These activities can be incredibly beneficial because they fuel progress and generate strong drive. However, when they are not balanced with low dopamine activities, the system becomes overloaded, and the brain's reward circuits adapt by lowering baseline dopamine. The result is that even high-value pursuits start to feel less rewarding, and motivation drops. Low dopamine activities, by contrast, are those that provide little to no external stimulation. Examples include walking without distractions, practicing meditation, journaling, sitting in silence, or performing simple repetitive tasks that don't involve much novelty. At first, these activities can feel boring or even uncomfortable, particularly for people who are used to constant stimulation. But biologically, they are powerful because they give the dopamine system a chance to reset. During these quieter periods, dopamine receptors can regain sensitivity, and baseline levels can normalize. Without these recovery phases, the brain remains stuck in a loop of chasing highs while never returning to balance. The real key lies not in eliminating high dopamine pursuits but in strategically alternating them with periods of low dopamine recovery. For instance, an athlete who trains intensely might deliberately schedule rest days with light walks or stretching to allow their nervous system to recover. A student who studies for hours at high intensity might include periods of calm reading or quiet reflection to reset their focus. The alternation between these states creates a sustainable cycle, where the highs remain motivating because the lows are allowed to recalibrate the system. Without this balance, effort eventually feels exhausting, and even enjoyable activities lose their spark. There is also a psychological benefit to incorporating low dopamine activities. These quiet moments allow space for reflection, creativity, and problem-solving that rarely occur when the brain is overstimulated. Many breakthroughs in science, art, and personal growth have emerged during periods of solitude, nature walks, or times when the mind was not bombarded with stimuli. The absence of constant external input allows internal connections to form more freely, leading to insights that would otherwise be drowned out by noise. Another way to create balance is by being mindful about not stacking too many dopamine sources together. For example, exercising while listening to music and consuming caffeine is a triple stack of dopamine that may feel incredible in the moment but can lead to a larger post-activity crash. Doing the same exercise without music or stimulants from time to time ensures that the activity itself remains rewarding rather than dependent on external dopamine boosts. This not only balances the system but also strengthens intrinsic motivation, teaching the brain to value effort in its pure form. Ultimately, the balance between high and low dopamine is what creates resilience. High dopamine activities push you forward, while low dopamine activities preserve the sensitivity of the system that fuels motivation. By respecting both states, you create a cycle that supports sustainable focus, consistent drive, and deeper satisfaction with the process of growth. Regulating dopamine for long-term focus means understanding that motivation is not meant to be a constant peak. Dopamine works in cycles, and those cycles are necessary for maintaining energy and drive over the course of days, weeks, and even years. When people assume they should feel highly motivated all the time, they often chase artificial methods of raising dopamine, through stimulants, excessive novelty, or reward stacking. This leads to short bursts of focus followed by deep crashes in energy and motivation. The key is not to try to eliminate these natural fluctuations but to work with them in a way that sustains focus for meaningful goals over the long term. One of the most effective ways to regulate dopamine is to build intentional periods of effort and rest into your daily structure. When you engage in deep work or focused training, dopamine rises and helps you sustain effort. But after that period, you need to allow time for dopamine to return to baseline rather than forcing it upward again. This could mean taking a walk without distractions, resting your eyes from screens, or doing something restorative that doesn't involve heavy stimulation. By alternating intense effort with deliberate recovery, you avoid draining your system and preserve the ability to re-engage with focus later. Mindset also plays a crucial role in regulating dopamine. If you approach every task with the belief that only the final outcome matters, your dopamine system becomes tied exclusively to external results. That leads to frustration and inconsistency because rewards are not always immediate. But if you shift perspective to appreciate the process, recognizing the act of effort itself is valuable, you engage dopamine more evenly across the journey. This mindset protects against burnout and makes long-term pursuits more sustainable. It also creates resilience, because even when results are delayed or uncertain, your system continues to release dopamine during the work itself. Another important aspect of regulation is limiting overstimulation from activities that artificially spike dopamine. For example, multitasking with constant phone notifications, consuming high-sugar foods, or binge watching content between work sessions overstimulates the dopamine system and reduces its ability to respond during tasks that require focus. By being intentional about removing or reducing these distractions, you allow the brain to direct dopamine toward the activities that truly matter. This helps you sustain deeper levels of concentration and prevents the erosion of motivation. Sleep and recovery strategies also regulate dopamine over the long term. Dopamine production relies on certain biological rhythms, including circadian patterns and natural replenishment that occurs during rest. Inadequate sleep or irregular routines disrupt these rhythms, leading to lower baseline dopamine and reduced focus. Prioritizing consistent sleep, balanced nutrition, and exercise creates the biological foundation for stable dopamine cycles. This stability supports not only day-to-day focus but also the endurance needed for multi-month or multi-year goals. Regulating dopamine isn't about suppressing excitement or eliminating reward but about using the system in a way that aligns with biology. By cycling effort with recovery, attaching meaning to the process, avoiding overstimulation, and maintaining healthy routines, you create an environment where dopamine supports sustained focus and consistent motivation over the long arc of your life and goals. Sustainable motivation depends on understanding that dopamine is not meant to provide endless highs but rather controlled cycles of rise and fall. Many people assume that the key to staying driven is to maximize dopamine as often as possible, but this strategy backfires. When dopamine is constantly spiked, the brain adapts by lowering its sensitivity, which makes normal activities feel unmotivating. The real path to lasting focus is learning how to regulate dopamine's natural rhythms so that motivation can be sustained without relying on artificial stimulation. This approach creates consistency rather than peaks and crashes. A central part of this regulation is recognizing that dopamine should be released during effort, not only at the moment of reward. If you wait for a prize or outcome to trigger dopamine, you experience long periods of low drive followed by a short spike that quickly fades. Over time, this weakens the system and makes it harder to stay engaged in long-term pursuits. Training yourself to find satisfaction in the act of effort itself creates smaller but steadier dopamine releases that carry you through tasks. By shifting attention from the outcome to the process, you transform the brain's chemistry to support ongoing action instead of delayed bursts of motivation. Another principle is embracing variability in dopamine release. Uncertainty and unpredictability naturally keep the dopamine system engaged. This is why learning new skills, exploring new challenges, and working under conditions where the outcome is not guaranteed often feel more stimulating than repeating tasks with guaranteed rewards. Introducing variability into your work, training, or studies, such as setting new challenges or changing routines, keeps dopamine firing in a way that supports engagement over time. Too much predictability leads to boredom, while too much intensity depletes the system. The balance between the two maintains drive without exhaustion. Rest is also a critical part of sustainable dopamine regulation. Just as muscles need recovery after exertion, the dopamine system requires periods of low stimulation to reset. Activities such as walking outdoors, meditation, or simply spending time without devices allow baseline dopamine to stabilize. When the baseline is protected, the brain remains responsive, making it easier to re-engage in focused effort. Without these periods of low stimulation, even the most exciting tasks lose their appeal because the dopamine system is already depleted. Biological health habits form the foundation for sustaining dopamine over months and years. Sleep replenishes dopamine stores and restores sensitivity in its receptors. Nutrition provides the raw materials, such as the amino acid tyrosine, for dopamine production. Exercise enhances receptor density and responsiveness. When these elements are in place, the brain has the capacity to regulate dopamine naturally. Without them, motivation feels like an uphill battle regardless of mental strategies. By aligning behavior with how dopamine actually functions, motivation becomes less fragile. The goal is not to eliminate dopamine lows but to manage them as part of the cycle. Allowing for recovery, attaching meaning to effort, introducing variability, and protecting biological health ensures that dopamine can continue to support focus and drive consistently. This balance creates a foundation for pursuing long-term goals without burning out or losing interest along the way.